What if Nazi Germany invaded the UK successfully? What if the fog of war lifted just enough for Hitler's forces to cross the English Channel? Not in failed rehearsal, but in thunderous reality. What if the British coast wasn't merely threatened in 1940, but breached, bloodied, and broken? Would the Union Jack still fly over London? Or would the swastika cast its shadow across Big Ben? To answer this, we must begin not with fantasy, but with truth. Summer 1940. France had fallen. Blitzkrieg had torn through Western Europe like a hot blade through butter. Paris surrendered in weeks. The British Expeditionary Force, barely rescued at Dunkirk, limped back across the Channel, battered and humiliated. All of Europe, from the Arctic Circle to the Pyrenees, trembled beneath Hitler's heel, but across the Channel, Winston Churchill stood defiant. "We shall fight on the beaches! Thunce!" he thundered. The island fortress was not ready to kneel. Germany's plan was codenamed Operation Sea Lion, an amphibious invasion of southern England. But it never launched. The Luftwaffe failed to gain air superiority in the Battle of Britain, and Hitler postponed, then abandoned the operation. But what if he didn't? What if Goering's planes had shattered the RAF? If radar stations were crippled? If Spitfires fell like autumn leaves into the Channel? Let us imagine that it was not the indomitable spirit of Britain that held back the tide, but merely time, luck, and thin margins. In this timeline, on the misty dawn of September 21, 1940, under the roar of Ju-87 Stukas and the cover of dense marine fog, the first wave of German landing craft cuts through the Channel. The invasion of Britain begins. Resistance is immediate, but scattered. British Home Guard volunteers, armed with pitchforks and hunting rifles, are no match for hardened Panzer Grenadiers. Portsmouth burns by evening. Paratroopers seize key rail junctions near Canterbury. German tanks roll into the Kentish countryside, and the British public watches in horror, not from afar, but from their bedroom windows. Churchill's war cabinet descends into chaos. The Royal Navy attempts to intercept the invasion fleet, but suffers heavy losses from German U-boats lying in wait. The nightmare that Britain had spent centuries avoiding, the boots of a foreign army on its soil, is now reality. But the war is not over, far from it. As the Germans consolidate the beachhead and prepare to march on London, Britain prepares to do something it hasn't done in nearly 1,000 years, fight a war on its own soil. What comes next is a question not of weapons, but of will. And as German soldiers raise the Reich flag over Dover Castle, a single transmission cuts through the static on British radio waves. This is London, calling. The heart of the empire still beats, but for how long? The thunder of boots echoes through the streets of Canterbury. German troops, disciplined and relentless, secure strongpoints with precision. The Wehrmacht's beachhead, centered around Dover, Folkestone, and Hastings, expands inland like a spreading stain, consuming the English countryside in calculated waves. Operation Sea Lion is no longer a plan. It is a conquest in motion. London watches with dread. Churchill, hoarse from days without sleep, delivers an emergency address from the underground war rooms. His voice, iron and gravel, crackles through radios across the empire. "We shall endure, we shall resist, and if our cities fall, then they shall become fortresses." But the enemy is not waiting. The Luftwaffe, now unopposed in the skies, darkens the daylight over southern England. London, already scarred from the Blitz, now endures a second wave, more deliberate, more devastating. Bombs fall not only on railways and munitions plants, but on hospitals, churches, and water stations. This is not strategic bombing. It is psychological warfare. And it works. Millions flee north. Roads jam with refugees, families clutching bundles, soldiers separated from their regiments, farmers abandoning generations of labor. The government, sensing collapse, begins a partial evacuation of London. The royal family is moved to Wales under heavy guard. Buckingham Palace, empty and silent, stands as a symbol of a vanishing past. But even as the government frays, resistance sharpens. From the rubble of blitz-broken neighborhoods, a different Britain begins to stir. Ex-soldiers, dock workers, and former miners band together into irregular units. They call themselves the British Resistance Organization, a shadow army backed quietly by Churchill and coordinated through secret radio posts hidden in pubs, bakeries, and countryside barns. Their weapons? Whatever they can steal, salvage, or sabotage. Their creed? If Britain cannot defend itself in daylight, it will strike in darkness. As the Wehrmacht advances through Surrey and Sussex, it encounters not only British soldiers, but burning bridges, derailed trains, and snipers hidden in hedgerows. A simple supply route from Dover to London becomes a gauntlet of death. And then, the first true battle of the new front begins. The Siege of London. German High Command, buoyed by swift gains, orders an armored thrust toward the capital. Panzer divisions rumble up the A2, smashing through token resistance near Rochester. The Thames glimmers in the distance, like a border of civilization. But London is no longer merely a city. It has become a fortress. Barricades rise from Piccadilly to Whitechapel. Tanks are hidden behind museum walls. Westminster Abbey becomes an ammo depot. Underground tunnels, tube stations long used for shelter during the Blitz, are repurposed for troop movement, medical triage, and counter-assault. Even schoolchildren are taught to throw petrol bombs from rooftops, and when the panzers reach the southern boroughs, they do not find a terrified population. They find urban warfare, brutal, close quarters, unrelenting. Entire apartment blocks are turned into nests for snipers. Sewer systems channel explosives beneath German encampments. Every cafe, every alley, every churchyard becomes a trap. German soldiers begin calling the city Die brennende Hölle, the burning hell. And in the chaos, Churchill remains. He refuses evacuation. Rumors spread that he's manning a machine gun on the roof of Parliament. Others claim he's taken refuge in the Tower of London, surrounded by commandos sworn to protect him with their lives. Truth blurs with legend, but one thing is certain: his broadcasts continue. "Let them come," he declares. "We shall not go quietly into the night. We are the fire they thought extinguished, and in the ashes of our cities we shall forge their defeat." The world listens. In Canada, Australia, and India, British dominions begin to mobilize. Supplies are loaded onto ships bound for the Atlantic. Volunteers pour in, pilots from Poland, sharpshooters from New Zealand, even a handful of Irishmen who refuse to see their island neighbor fall under Nazi rule. But the Atlantic is no longer safe. German U-boats now swarm in wolf packs, sinking convoys with surgical precision. The Royal Navy, stretched thin, struggles to maintain open sea lanes. Food rationing tightens. Medical supplies dwindle. London begins to starve. And yet, the Union Jack still flies. By October, a grim stalemate sets in. The Germans control the south coast. The British hold London and the north. But both sides are bleeding. Every kilometer gained costs lives. Every building held is soon reduced to rubble. And then, the Axis makes its next move. Not with tanks, but with terror. German intelligence identifies leaders of the British underground. Executions begin in the occupied zones. Families disappear overnight. Radios go silent. A whisper runs through Kent and Sussex. The Gestapo has arrived. And where the Gestapo goes, fear follows. But so does fury. Winter descends upon England like a curse. The days grow shorter. The nights grow longer. And in the occupied southern counties, darkness is no longer merely a fact of nature. It is a weapon. The Gestapo arrives in black cars and silence, their presence felt before it is seen. Curfews are imposed. Posters bearing stern faces in German uniform begin to line the stone walls of Dover, Brighton, Maidstone. Obedience is safety. Resistance is death. The occupation is not uniform. While German regulars maintain military control, it is the SS and Gestapo who administer order. They set up temporary headquarters in government buildings, post guards at town halls, and send informants into churches and pubs. Any whisper of disloyalty is punished swiftly. Librarians are arrested for distributing Churchill's speeches. Teachers vanish for refusing to instruct students in German. Even the ringing of Big Ben, long a symbol of national pride, is silenced. But silence does not mean surrender. In London and across unoccupied England, the British resistance mutates into something larger, more lethal, more disciplined. What began as spontaneous sabotage now evolves into a networked insurgency. Former military officers, some of whom fought in France, others in North Africa, begin training guerrilla cells. Couriers operate under false identities, cycling between safe houses. Caches of arms are hidden inside coal sheds, under cemetery stones, behind false walls, in tailor shops. The resistance gives itself a new name, Project Albion. Its goal is not simply to fight, it is to make occupation impossible. One night, an entire train carrying Wehrmacht ammunition explodes outside of Ashford, a crater the size of a house left in its place. In another instance, a German general is killed by a booby-trapped radio in a commandeered Sussex manor. Children pass notes between safe houses. Housewives forge German documents in sewing baskets. Priests offer last rites in Latin and coded messages in the pauses between. In response, the occupiers tighten their grip. Whole neighborhoods are cordoned off and searched. Resistance members are publicly hanged in market squares. But even as fear grows, so does anger. The more brutal the crackdown, the more ordinary Britons begin to resist, not for politics, but for dignity. What the Reich thought would be a campaign of quick subjugation has become a war of attrition, not only on the battlefield, but in every heart. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, something shifts. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had long walked a tightrope. The American public, still haunted by the losses of World War I, opposed entering another European war. But now, with Britain invaded, its capital under siege, its people hunted, the tide begins to turn. Photos leak into American newspapers. A bombed-out hospital in London, a crying boy in a crumbled row house, the lifeless body of a British radio operator who refused to give up his transmitter. These images stir something in the American soul. Roosevelt speaks before Congress in late November 1940. The lights of liberty are going out across Europe. If Britain falls, who will stand next? This is no longer Britain's fight. It is the fight of every man who believes in freedom. He does not declare war, not yet, but he announces the Atlantic Lifeline, a clandestine initiative to supply Britain through neutral shipping routes, using private American vessels under false flags. Weapons, radios, fuel, even volunteers, many of them veterans of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade from the Spanish Civil War, begin to make the treacherous journey across the ocean. It is dangerous work. German U-boats sink many of them. But for every ship lost, 2 more replace it. And in the holds of these ships come not just guns, but hope. Inside Britain, the resistance begins using American-made equipment. Thompson's submachine guns, high-frequency radios, demolition timers, all smuggled in crates labeled farm equipment or textiles. With this new supply chain, Project Albion strikes bolder. They derail trains not just in Kent, but in Hampshire. They assassinate German officers at checkpoints disguised as milkmen. They blow a hole in the side of the German command center in Southampton, using nothing but fertilizer and stolen detonators, and they send a message: Britain lives. Still, the Reich is far from losing. On the contrary, it begins to adapt. Reinhard Heydrich, architect of the SS intelligence apparatus, is appointed as Governor General of occupied Britain. He reorganizes the police, creates a British collaborationist force known as the English Ordnungstruppen, and begins a campaign of cultural assimilation. German becomes mandatory in schools. Anglican churches are replaced with state-approved chapels. English monuments are destroyed or replaced with symbols of the Reich. But even here, the effort backfires. Instead of erasing British identity, it crystallizes it. Poems are written on walls in invisible ink. Underground newspapers circulate Churchill's speeches from memory. Citizens wear small pieces of red, white, blue thread sewn into their coats. A whisper moves through the slums of London and the hills of Yorkshire. They may take the land, but never the flag. In the countryside, rumors swirl of a secret base, somewhere in the Scottish Highlands, where remnants of the British Army are regrouping. Pilots who escaped to Canada are said to be training in new squadrons. A new symbol begins appearing: graffiti in bombed buildings and carved into tree trunks. A lion, bleeding but roaring still. In the occupied zones, Heydrich senses something he cannot kill with bullets or fear: a spirit. And across the world, others begin to notice too. In Berlin, beneath marble ceilings and iron chandeliers, Adolf Hitler studies a map of the British Isles. His blue eyes scan the red pins scattered across southern England, the gray lines of movement, the black dots marking insurgent attacks. His face is unreadable, but his fingers twitch, as if tracing not borders, but destiny. He had done what even Napoleon had failed to do: bring Britain to her knees. But it was not surrendering, and that made him uneasy. The British campaign, intended to last weeks, was now entering its fourth brutal month. German troops were bogged down in city blocks, ambushed in quiet forests, haunted by a population that refused to be conquered. The Luftwaffe, though dominant in the skies, could not bomb the will from a people who had already lost everything. Hitler needed a shift, not a tactical adjustment, but a new theater of advantage. He turns east. Even in this altered timeline, the temptation of the Soviet Union is unchanged. Lebensraum, living space, was his ideological obsession, and the vast steppes of Russia beckoned. He believed Britain, even occupied, could be neutralized. The real threat lay in the east, and if Moscow could be taken before winter, Germany would reign from the Atlantic to the Urals. But his generals were not convinced. Field Marshal von Rundstedt warned, "We have opened a wound in Britain. If we leave it to fester, it will rot the arm." Yet Hitler, convinced of British collapse and Soviet inferiority, ordered the final preparations for Operation Barbarossa. The Eastern Front would open by spring. Back in Britain, the shift is noticed immediately. German forces in the UK halt major advances. Air raids become less frequent. Armored divisions are quietly redeployed to the continent. Resistance leaders, sensing the moment, surge forward. The Scottish Highlands become a staging ground for guerrilla coordination. RAF pilots begin returning, smuggled in by Canadian submarines that surface in the dead of night near Liverpool. And Churchill re-emerges. His voice, silent for weeks, returns in a broadcast smuggled to neutral Ireland and relayed globally. Let it be known, from Berlin to Vladivostok, that the lion has not fallen. He waits, and he remembers. The world listens. In Washington, Roosevelt reads the transcript in silence. He taps his fingers against the desk. The U.S. presidential election has passed. He has won an unprecedented third term. But now, with Japan growing more aggressive in the Pacific and Germany stretched thin between two fronts, Roosevelt sees a sliver of opportunity, not just to aid Britain, but to shape the post-war world, before the war is even over. He approves Operation Torchlight, an intelligence partnership with British resistance fighters. American OSS agents begin infiltrating German-occupied Britain. They bring radios, codes, aerial maps. Their presence is denied in every official channel, but the Axis suspects the truth. Meanwhile, in the East, another empire watches closely. In Moscow, Joseph Stalin is uncharacteristically patient. The Soviet Union, though suspicious of Germany, had signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression agreement. But Stalin knew better than to trust a man like Hitler. Soviet spies within German command had reported troop movements, supply chains, and shifting priorities. Now, with the Wehrmacht bleeding in Britain, Stalin begins quietly reinforcing his Western Front. Tanks roll toward the borders of Belarus and Ukraine. Factories in the Urals churn out thousands of rifles and artillery shells. The Soviet Union is not ready to strike, but it is preparing for survival. And in the shadows of Asia, another player grows bold. Tokyo sees Europe distracted. The German invasion of Britain, while seemingly a triumph, has consumed resources and attention. Japanese high command believes the time has come to strike south, to seize Indonesia, the Philippines, and perhaps even challenge American power in the Pacific. Pearl Harbor is no longer just a plan. It is a ticking clock. Back in occupied England, the situation turns paradoxical. German rule tightens. Curfews are harsher, propaganda thicker, arrests more arbitrary. But resistance stiffens. Whole towns vanish into rebellion. Collaborators are marked with red paint on their doors. Bridges collapse before convoys. The black market flourishes, supplied by Canadian and American smugglers who now call themselves Atlantic rats. And then, something breaks. In February 1941, an SS convoy is ambushed outside Guildford. Among the dead is a senior Gestapo official known for orchestrating mass arrests. In retaliation, German forces massacre 73 civilians in a nearby village. The act is filmed, distributed as a warning. But it backfires. The footage leaks, smuggled to neutral Ireland, then to the US, then broadcast across the world. For the first time, global opinion shifts irreversibly. In the United States, Roosevelt's opponents falter. Isolationism weakens, drafts begin, factories expand, and Congress, once reluctant, begins whispering the word it had long avoided. War. The snow was melting over the cliffs of Cornwall when the first American boots touched British soil. It began not with headlines, not with flags, but with whispers, carried by wind and code and static-laced radio. A rumor, impossible, but too sweet not to believe. American soldiers had landed in Devon, not in battalions, not in fanfare, but in shadow. It was true. Under the codename Operation Firebridge, a covert detachment of the U.S. Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, had made landfall in western England. Their orders were not to engage, but to observe, to assess, to light beacons in the dark. They were joined by Canadian commandos, rogue Free French fighters, and elements of the scattered British Home Army. These weren't formal uniforms and marching drills. This was war in rags and grit. And it was about to change everything. The Americans came with maps, painstakingly drawn by British resistance fighters who'd charted every checkpoint, every minefield, every SS stronghold from Cornwall to Kent. They came with radios encrypted in Navajo code, with demolition charges, forged currency, and a mission simple in theory, deadly in practice: disrupt, divide, delay. And they succeeded. On March 7, 1941, a railway bridge near Bristol carrying German fuel convoys was blown skyward. On the same day, resistance cells in Manchester struck 3 German patrols, leaving behind calling cards scrawled with the American flag. The world took notice. Germany responded with rage. Reich broadcasts accused the U.S. of betrayal, claiming Anglo-American terrorism now threatens European stability. Hitler himself, incandescent in private, reportedly ordered plans drawn up for submarine attacks on the U.S. eastern seaboard. Though none would materialize, the intent was clear. But America had crossed the threshold. The veil of neutrality had been torn, and with it, the isolationist spell over the American heartland began to unravel. In New York, thousands gathered in Times Square to hear Roosevelt speak. He did not yet declare war, but he did not deny its coming. There will come a day when liberty must speak not in hopes, but in fire. That day is near. Back in Britain, the American presence gave shape to something long imagined but never real: the idea of reversal. The resistance, once fractured and hunted, now operated with coordination. Drops from American submarines brought not just supplies, but new tactics, new morale. British operatives were trained in sabotage by U.S. veterans of the Spanish Civil War. Coastal towns in Wales became training grounds for joint guerrilla units, Albion's teeth sharpened in exile. Even London, still besieged, began to breathe again. In the crypts beneath St. Paul's Cathedral, a secret council formed: British generals, resistance leaders, OSS liaisons, and, at its center, Winston Churchill, pale but unbowed. From here, they began planning the unthinkable: Liberation. But liberation would require more than courage. It would need the world. Roosevelt, facing pressure at home and chaos abroad, moved cautiously. The Atlantic lifeline was expanded. Convoys began sailing under American escort. Lend-Lease legislation passed, funneling weapons and material to Britain faster than ever before. Training camps opened in Canada and Greenland, preparing American troops for a future assault. But the world was not waiting. In Moscow, the ice began to crack. German forces, now redeploying from Britain to the Soviet border, were spotted by Soviet reconnaissance. Despite the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Stalin no longer trusted his own ink. He ordered full mobilization, quietly, ruthlessly. The USSR was not yet in the war, but it was no longer on the sidelines. Meanwhile, Japan's eyes turned south. With Europe distracted and America entangled in Britain, Tokyo advanced into French Indochina. The Philippines, defended by scattered American forces, braced for impact. But the heart of the war, for now, still beat in Britain. By April 1941, a line had formed. The North, Scotland, Wales, and much of central England, remained free. The South, London surrounded but defiant, the coast held an iron grip, remained occupied. Between them stretched a no-man's land of sabotage, skirmish, and smoke. It was here, in the Midlands, that a different kind of battle unfolded, not for land, but for loyalty. The Germans, desperate to contain rebellion, accelerated efforts to establish a puppet regime. They found allies among the desperate, the bitter, and the ambitious, those willing to rule their neighbors for safety and power. A shadow government was declared in Canterbury, backed by SS security and a handful of British collaborators. Its leader? Oswald Mosley. Once a fringe fascist politician, Mosley now declared himself Prime Minister of the New Britain, promising order, prosperity, and peace under German oversight. His broadcasts echoed across the occupied zones, slick and insidious. Some believed him, most spat at their radios, but the danger wasn't in Mosley's words. It was in what they represented. The slow erosion of national unity. Germans hoped to pit Britain against Britain, to weaken the resolve from within. And for a moment, it nearly worked. Civil tensions spiked in occupied towns. Former friends accused each other. Resistance fighters clashed with collaborators. German security forces staged false flag bombings to pin on insurgents. But one event changed the tide. In May 1941, a group of schoolchildren in Portsmouth smuggled stolen explosives into a German-controlled munitions depot. The blast leveled 4 city blocks. The Germans retaliated with executions. Dozens of civilians taken to the docks and shot at sunrise. But the story of children choosing defiance over submission spread like wildfire. From Aberdeen to Bristol, a cry returned to British lips. "We are not conquered." The snow was melting over the cliffs of Cornwall when the first American boots touched British soil. It began not with headlines, not with flags, but with whispers, carried by wind and code and static-laced radio. A rumor, impossible but too sweet not to believe. American soldiers had landed in Devon, not in battalions, not in fanfare, but in shadow. It was true. Under the code name Operation Firebridge, a covert detachment of the U.S. Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, had made landfall in western England. Their orders were not to engage, but to observe, to assess, to light beacons in the dark. They were joined by Canadian commandos, rogue Free French fighters, and elements of the scattered British Home Army. These weren't formal uniforms and marching drills. This was war in rags and grit, and it was about to change everything. The Americans came with maps, painstakingly drawn by British resistance fighters who'd charted every checkpoint, every minefield, every SS stronghold from Cornwall to Kent. They came with radios encrypted in Navajo code, with demolition charges, forged currency, and a mission simple in theory, deadly in practice. Disrupt, divide, delay. And they succeeded. On March 7, 1941, a railway bridge near Bristol carrying German fuel convoys was blown skyward. On the same day, resistance cells in Manchester struck 3 German patrols, leaving behind calling cards scrawled with the American flag. The world took notice. Germany responded with rage. Reich broadcasts accused the U.S. of betrayal, claiming Anglo-American terrorism now threatens European stability. Hitler himself, incandescent in private, reportedly ordered plans drawn up for submarine attacks on the U.S. eastern seaboard. Though none would materialize, the intent was clear. But America had crossed the threshold. The veil of neutrality had been torn, and with it, the isolationist spell over the American heartland began to unravel. In New York, thousands gathered in Times Square to hear Roosevelt speak. He did not yet declare war, but he did not deny its coming. There will come a day when liberty must speak not in hopes, but in fire. That day is near. Back in Britain, the American presence gave shape to something long imagined, but never real: the idea of reversal. The resistance, once fractured and hunted, now operated with coordination. Drops from American submarines brought not just supplies, but new tactics, new morale. British operatives were trained in sabotage by U.S. veterans of the Spanish Civil War. Coastal towns in Wales became training grounds for joint guerrilla units, Albion's teeth sharpened in exile. Even London, still besieged, began to breathe again. In the crypts beneath St. Paul's Cathedral, a secret council formed. British generals, resistance leaders, OSS liaisons, and, at its center, Winston Churchill, pale but unbuoyed. From here, they began planning the unthinkable: liberation. But liberation would require more than courage. It would need the world. Roosevelt, facing pressure at home and chaos abroad, moved cautiously. The Atlantic lifeline was expanded. Convoys began sailing under American escort. Lend-Lease legislation passed, funneling weapons and materiel to Britain faster than ever before. Training camps opened in Canada and Greenland, preparing American troops for a future assault. But the world was not waiting. In Moscow, the ice began to crack. German forces, now redeploying from Britain to the Soviet border, were spotted by Soviet reconnaissance. Despite the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Stalin no longer trusted his own ink. He ordered full mobilization, quietly, ruthlessly. The USSR was not yet in the war, but it was no longer on the sidelines. Meanwhile, Japan's eyes turned south. With Europe distracted and America entangled in Britain, Tokyo advanced into French Indochina. The Philippines, defended by scattered American forces, braced for impact. But the heart of the war, for now, still beat in Britain. By April 1941, a line had formed. The north, Scotland, Wales, and much of central England remained free. The south, London surrounded but defiant, the coast held in iron grip, remained occupied. Between them stretched a no-man's land of sabotage, skirmish, and smoke. It was here, in the Midlands, that a different kind of battle unfolded, not for land, but for loyalty. The Germans, desperate to contain rebellion, accelerated efforts to establish a puppet regime. They found allies among the desperate, the bitter, and the ambitious, those willing to rule their neighbors for safety and power. A shadow government was declared in Canterbury, backed by SS security and a handful of British collaborators. Its leader? Oswald Mosley. Once a fringe fascist politician, Mosley now declared himself Prime Minister of the New Britain, promising order, prosperity, and peace, under German oversight. His broadcasts echoed across the occupied zones, slick and insidious. Some believed him. Most spat at their radios. But the danger wasn't in Mosley's words. It was in what they represented: the slow erosion of national unity. Germans hoped to pit Britain against Britain, to weaken the resolve from within. And for a moment, it nearly worked. Civil tensions spiked in occupied towns. Former friends accused each other. Resistance fighters clashed with collaborators. German security forces staged false flag bombings to pin on insurgents. But one event changed the tide. In May 1941, a group of schoolchildren in Portsmouth smuggled stolen explosives into a German-controlled munitions depot. The blast leveled 4 city blocks. The Germans retaliated with executions. Dozens of civilians taken to the docks and shot at sunrise. But the story of children choosing defiance over submission spread like wildfire. From Aberdeen to Bristol, a cry returned to British lips. "We are not conquered." By the summer of 1941, Britain was no longer just an island. It was a symbol, a torn, scorched, bleeding symbol of resistance. And symbols are dangerous. From the rain-swept alleys of Liverpool to the muddy streets of Moscow, eyes turned toward the British Isles, not with pity, but with purpose. What was once a local struggle had metastasized into a global reckoning. The war was no longer about territory. It was about ideology. The German occupation of southern England, once presented as a strategic masterstroke, had become a thorn in Hitler's side. Resistance was unrelenting. The cost of keeping British soil under Nazi control had become astronomical, measured not just in bullets and bombs, but in time, morale, and blood. The Führer's gaze, now firmly eastward, grew impatient. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, breaking its non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union and plunging the world into a two-front war of annihilation. 3 million Axis troops stormed across the eastern border, sweeping through the Baltic states and into Ukraine. Hitler believed the Soviet colossus would collapse quickly, but Stalin had been watching and waiting. The Red Army, though reeling, did not fall. Soviet resistance stiffened around the scorched ruins of Kiev, Minsk, Smolensk. Soviet factories moved deep beyond the Urals, pumped out tanks and Katyusha rockets at astonishing speed. For every town Germany captured, it paid in frozen corpses. And the West took notice. Roosevelt, already walking the tightrope of undeclared war, now faced mounting pressure from both ends of the globe. The Axis wasn't shrinking, it was expanding. German troops in England, Japanese forces sweeping through Southeast Asia, and now the Soviets in desperate battle. Neutrality was no longer tenable. In August 1941, a quiet meeting took place in the waters off Newfoundland. On board the USS Augusta, President Roosevelt met secretly with Winston Churchill, still alive, still defiant, still coordinating the resistance from the north of England. There, on salt-stained maps and over cups of bitter tea, the two men outlined a new vision for the war and what must follow. From that meeting came the Atlantic Charter, a statement not of military alliance, but of shared values: freedom of the seas, self-determination of peoples, the defeat of tyranny. It was the ideological framework for a world not yet free, but determined to become so. More importantly, it laid the groundwork for something greater: a unified front. By September, American convoys were sailing openly across the Atlantic, escorted by U.S. destroyers. The neutral label became laughable, and in October, after a German U-boat torpedoed the USS Reuben James, killing over 100 American sailors, the laughter stopped. Roosevelt signed the orders. American warships were now authorized to fire on German vessels on sight. War had not been declared, but it had arrived. In Britain, the impact was immediate. The trickle of American supplies became a torrent. OSS agents expanded their network deep into the Midlands, now coordinating joint missions with British resistance cells. A new division, codenamed Task Force Lion, was formed, composed of British irregulars, American Rangers, and Canadian volunteers. Their job was to prepare the ground for what everyone now knew was coming: the counter-invasion. But they weren't the only ones preparing. In Berlin, Hitler's paranoia deepened. He authorized Operation Iron Fist, a brutal campaign of mass internments and executions in occupied Britain. Thousands were rounded up: suspected insurgents, former military officers, anyone with ties to the North. Concentration camps, once unthinkable on British soil, began to emerge in the outskirts of Southampton and Canterbury. The world recoiled. Photos, leaked by a rogue SS photographer, found their way to Swedish diplomats and into American newspapers. One image, a teenage boy staring blankly through barbed wire, became the rallying symbol for a new wave of resistance. The phrase, "never again, not here," began appearing on walls across Britain, from train stations in Birmingham to barns in Yorkshire. And yet, the Germans were not beaten. Their grip, while strained, was brutal. Every resistance action was met with savage reprisal. Roads were mined, villages were razed. The Midlands had become a battlefield, muddy, bloody, and without mercy. But something was changing. British intelligence, working with American codebreakers, had begun intercepting high-level German communications. The Enigma machine, once unbreakable, had been cracked by a team of mathematicians led by the brilliant and tormented Alan Turing. Suddenly, Churchill and Roosevelt knew where German forces were moving, when convoys were weakest, and where the cracks in the occupation were forming. Knowledge became power, and power, when aimed well, became sabotage. In one daring raid, resistance forces, guided by American recon, ambushed a German fuel convoy bound for the Southern Front. The explosion could be heard from 30 miles away. Days later, dozens of panzer tanks sat idle near Oxford, dry and vulnerable. Every German misstep was no longer an accident. It was a design. And then came the final spark. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese Empire struck Pearl Harbor. The Pacific boiled in fire. Battleships burned. Over 2,000 Americans died, and in the blood and smoke, the last illusion shattered. The United States declared war. Germany, bound by alliance, declared war in return. The conflict had become a true world war, and Britain, divided, battered, but unbroken, was now the front line of liberation. The turning point didn't come with a bang, but with silence, the kind that settles just before the storm. In early 1942, the world held its breath. Across the Atlantic, across the North Sea, across the shattered fields of Britain, a single idea crystallized. This was the moment. The tide had shifted. The enemy was extended, distracted, and overconfident. The time to strike had come. But to strike Britain, one had to retake Britain. And so began the most ambitious military operation in modern history. It had no official name, not yet. In corridors beneath Washington, in bunkers under London, and in steel hangars across Canada, it was whispered as a code, as a prayer: homecoming. The Allies, now officially united under the declaration signed after Pearl Harbor, began planning not just for resistance, but for reclamation. Britain would not merely survive. It would be reborn. At the center of the plan was Ireland. Though officially neutral, Ireland had long served as a silent artery for the flow of Allied intelligence and aid. Now, under immense diplomatic pressure and promises of full post-war sovereignty, the Irish government granted secret access to several Western ports and airfields. And in those ports, in the dead of night, steel arrived. American Liberty ships, British war freighters, Canadian transports, all unloading not just crates of weapons and food, but men, thousands of soldiers, engineers, and medical staff. In a sprawling valley west of Limerick, a forward operations base rose from farmland. By March, it was a city of tents, steel, and strategy. It housed Task Force Homecoming, a coalition of Allied forces trained specifically for one purpose: invading occupied Britain from the west. Their leaders were a strange choir of accents and tempers. General George S. Patton, brash and relentless. General Bernard Montgomery, cautious but brilliant. And Air Marshal Arthur Harris, architect of the RAF's coming vengeance. They debated. They argued. But they agreed on the objective: cut the snake at its neck, drive through southern Britain, isolate London, and crush the Nazi presence before reinforcements could arrive from mainland Europe. But there was one problem. The Germans knew it was coming. Nazi high command had long suspected a counter-invasion. Now, with U-boats patrolling the Irish Sea and Luftwaffe reconnaissance probing the western coasts, their fears were confirmed. Hitler ordered Fortress Britain, a massive expansion of defenses along the western shores. Beaches were mined. Concrete bunkers were poured into cliffs. Entire towns were evacuated to make way for German artillery emplacements. The SS recruited more collaborators, many by force, and turned entire villages into armed garrisons, but no wall could stop the wind. Inside Britain, the resistance had become more than an irritation. It was now an army in waiting. In northern England, clandestine factories, hidden beneath barns and cathedrals, assembled crude weapons, Molotovs, pistols, homemade grenades. In Wales, old mine shafts were converted into staging grounds. In Scotland, free British divisions trained alongside American commandos under the shroud of Highland mist. They were waiting for the signal, and that signal would come from the skies. On April 18, 1942, the Allied air campaign against occupied Britain began. It started with Operation Eclipse, a wave of coordinated bombing runs targeting German infrastructure across the South. RAF and U.S. bombers, guided by resistance-supplied maps, hit railway yards, fuel depots, and communication lines. The Germans were caught flat-footed. They had expected bombs to fall over Berlin, not Bristol. They had fortified the east, not the west. The assault was brutal. Cities already scarred from the Blitz were shattered anew. But this time, the explosions meant hope. In the chaos, Task Force Lion struck. Coordinated resistance uprisings erupted across Kent, Surrey, and parts of occupied London. In Reading, a German command post was seized by armed locals. In Guildford, resistance fighters assassinated a high-ranking SS officer in broad daylight. Church bells, long silenced, began ringing, coded signals to fighters in hiding. The occupation was unraveling, and then, on May 3, 1942, just before dawn, the sea exploded. From the horizon came the steel swarm, Allied landing craft by the hundreds, roaring toward the beaches of Devon and Cornwall. Above them, the sky thundered with Spitfires and Mustangs, clearing the air of German fighters. Behind them, the massive guns of Allied cruisers opened fire, pounding German positions. The invasion had begun. It was not clean. It was not swift. The Germans fought like wounded wolves, snipers in every village, machine gun nests in every hedgerow. But they were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, outwilled. By the third day, Allied forces had secured a corridor inland. By the fifth, they had linked up with resistance units in Exeter and Plymouth. By the seventh, a new British flag was raised in liberated territory, tattered, soot-stained, but flying. London felt the shock. German command scrambled to hold the capital, reinforcements were called from the continent, but the Eastern Front was devouring men by the thousands. Hitler, enraged and desperate, demanded a counterattack. But his generals knew. This wasn't France in 1940. This was Britain. And Britain was coming back. They called it the Iron Circle. A ring of steel, concrete, and death that wrapped around occupied London like a noose. Trenches dug through Hyde Park. Machine gun nests embedded in the British Museum. Sniper towers erected atop Parliament itself, once the seat of democracy, now a fortress for tyranny. This was not the London of postcards. This was a battlefield. After the Allied landings in Cornwall and the swift liberation of southwest England, the push toward the capital became inevitable. The Germans knew it. So did the resistance. So did every civilian with eyes to the smoke rising beyond the southern hills. London would not be taken. It would have to be won. General Bernard Montgomery, placed in overall command of the Allied land assault, planned meticulously. His strategy relied on pincers, coordinated attacks from the west and the north, with a simultaneous uprising from within. Resistance cells embedded in the city had waited for this moment for nearly 2 years. They would now ignite the match. But Hitler had his own plans. Knowing the symbolic power of London, he diverted troops from France and even the Eastern Front to reinforce the garrison. Over 60,000 Axis troops now held positions in and around the city. Many were SS fanatics, ready to die rather than give up a single street. The battle for London began on May 18, 1942. It started at dawn with air raids. Allied bombers roared overhead, dropping precision strikes on known German barracks, ammo depots, and communication towers. Smoke billowed from Camden to Chelsea. Bridges across the Thames were hit, but not destroyed. They were needed for what came next. At 0700 hours, the ground assault began. Canadian armored divisions pushed in from the west, storming through Slough and Hounslow. American paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines, linked up with British fighters hiding in Ealing and Acton. From the north, Free French and Polish battalions surged through Barnet and Finchley, flanking German checkpoints one by one. The defenders responded with fire and fury. Streets became choke points. Entire blocks were reduced to ruins and booby traps. German sharpshooters used London's historic buildings to lethal effect: Big Ben, St. Paul's Cathedral, the Tower. The city that once shaped an empire was now devouring itself. But the people had made their choice. Civilians fought alongside soldiers. Elderly men passed ammunition to snipers in windows. Teenage boys threw Molotovs from rooftops. Nurses converted subway tunnels into trauma centers, treating friend and foe alike under flickering gaslight. A bakery in Southwark became a resistance command post. A church in Islington rang its bell for the first time in 2 years, the signal for uprising. Inside Whitehall, the Germans clung to their last grip on command. Their radio transmissions became desperate. Request reinforcements. Out of ammunition. Surrounded. Allied codebreakers intercepted the calls and smiled grimly. The Iron Circle was breaking, but the battle reached its apex at Westminster. The Houses of Parliament, once bombed in the Blitz and now heavily fortified, were the nerve center of the occupation. SS forces had transformed it into their last bastion: barbed wire, sandbags, machine guns in the House of Lords. It became the focus of the final assault. Task Force Lion, composed of hand-picked British, American, and Canadian commandos, was given the mission: storm Parliament, neutralize SS leadership, and recapture the symbolic heart of Britain. They moved under cover of night, through sewers mapped by Londoners who once worked them. Emerging behind German lines, they struck fast and brutal. Room by room, corridor by corridor, they fought. The final standoff came in the chamber where Churchill once roared defiance. Now it was littered with the fallen. An SS commander tried to destroy the chamber with satchel charges, but was shot by a resistance fighter using a revolver once owned by his grandfather. By dawn on May 24th, the Union Jack flew again over Westminster. Not perfectly. It was shredded, blood-stained, and hung from a broken pole. But it flew. All across London, the tide turned. German forces, cut off and surrounded, began surrendering en masse. The commandant of occupied London was captured trying to escape in a stolen Red Cross vehicle. Others chose suicide rather than face justice, but victory came at a cost. Over 12,000 Allied troops died in the battle. Tens of thousands more were wounded. Civilian casualties were catastrophic, whole neighborhoods reduced to ash. But the cost was paid, and London, bruised, scarred, proud, was free. Churchill emerged from his hidden bunker in Scotland 3 days later. Thin, pale but standing tall, he addressed the crowds in Trafalgar Square. "We have not merely survived, we have defied. This city, this nation, this people have proven that freedom may be bombed, buried, and broken, but it cannot be beaten." The crowd, many still wearing rags and soot, roared, and in Berlin, Hitler raged in silence. He had lost London. The city was free, but London was a shadow of itself. Streets once vibrant with life now lay in ruins. Buildings, iconic and historic, were shattered facades clinging to memories. The air still smelled of smoke and gunpowder, mingled with the acrid scent of loss. Yet, amidst the rubble, life stirred. The end of the German occupation was not a fairy tale of joyous reunions and triumphant parades. It was chaos born of decades of trauma, fear, and fractured loyalties. The people of Britain faced a daunting truth. Liberation was only the beginning. The first days after victory revealed cracks both old and new. Thousands of collaborators, men and women, who had aided the Nazi regime, were rounded up. Some had worn German uniforms, others had sold secrets, rooted out resistance fighters, or simply kept silent as neighbors disappeared. Retribution was swift, often brutal. Trials were held in makeshift courts, but justice was not always blind. Revenge lurked in every verdict. Families torn apart by suspicion and bitterness struggled to find reconciliation. Among the most complicated were those who had joined the Englische Ordnungstruppen, the British collaborationist force. Some claimed coercion, others fervent belief. The line between patriot and traitor blurred. Neighborhoods divided into factions, and the specter of civil conflict loomed. Meanwhile, the physical rebuilding was a colossal task. London's infrastructure, roads, bridges, water systems, was crippled. The government scrambled to restore essential services. The Blitz had already drained the nation's reserves. The occupation had bled it dry. But the spirit of survival burned bright. Across the country, communities rallied. Volunteers dug trenches anew, not for defense, but for rebuilding. Factories pivoted from war production to reconstruction. Immigrants from the Commonwealth, many having fought alongside the Allies, returned with skills and determination, and the government began to grapple with the broader question, what next? Churchill, though hailed as a hero, faced growing opposition. His wartime rhetoric no longer sufficed in the face of domestic hardship. Labor and liberal factions demanded social reforms, housing, and economic revitalization. The shadow of war hung heavily over elections. Internationally, Britain's return sent ripples. The Nazi defeat on British soil marked a turning point in the war. German forces were now fully committed to the Eastern Front, stretched perilously thin. The Soviet Union, still fighting for survival, gained renewed hope. The United States accelerated its war efforts, with Britain now a critical staging ground for operations in Europe. But victory also brought new dilemmas. The Atlantic Charter promised self-determination for all peoples, yet Britain's colonial empire, stretched across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, began to fray. Independence movements gained momentum, fueled by the contradictions of a free Britain still ruling overseas. In the shadows, Soviet and American intelligence operatives jockeyed for influence over post-war plans. The seeds of a new global conflict, the Cold War, were sown amid the rubble of the old. Back home, Britain wrestled with identity. Was this the end of empire, the dawn of a new social order, or merely a pause before the next storm? And in the quiet moments, survivors, soldiers, resistance fighters, civilians, wondered, had the cost been worth it? Had their sacrifice changed the world for the better? The war was not yet over. The Axis still fought fiercely in Eastern Europe and North Africa. But Britain, once a symbol of defiance, was becoming the heart of a new alliance. The collapse of Nazi Germany did not come swiftly. It was a grinding, relentless unraveling, like a tapestry pulled thread by thread until only tatters remained. By late 1943, the tide of war had fully turned. The Soviet Red Army, bolstered by American and British supplies, routed through liberated Britain, pushed westward in a juggernaut of steel and fire. The Wehrmacht, drained by battles on two fronts, fought desperately to hold lines that grew thinner by the day. The British Isles, now a launchpad for Allied offensives, thrummed with activity. Airfields buzzed with Spitfires, Mustangs, and Lancasters. Shipyards in Liverpool and Glasgow churned out vessels destined to reclaim continental Europe. The liberation of France in 1944, Operation Overlord, was a mirror to the earlier Allied landings on British soil. But this time the momentum was unstoppable. Paris was freed. Belgium and the Netherlands followed. The Reich was collapsing from within. Inside Germany, Hitler's grip tightened but faltered. Paranoia ran rampant. Generals whispered of assassination plots, and the Nazi leadership fractured. Meanwhile, the war crimes uncovered shocked the world. Mass graves in Poland, gas chambers in Auschwitz, and atrocities beyond imagining. The horrors galvanized the Allied cause, but darkened the future with a grim question: how to rebuild a shattered Europe, and at what cost? At the Yalta and Potsdam conferences, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin debated fiercely. Boundaries were redrawn, spheres of influence divided. Britain, despite its hardships, remained a key player, a symbol of resilience and the fragile bridge between the American and Soviet spheres. Yet beneath the diplomacy, tensions simmered. The ideological battle lines of the Cold War were already being drawn. For Britain, the war's end was bittersweet. The empire began its slow unraveling, accelerated by the contradictions laid bare by occupation and liberation. Independence movements in India, Africa, and the Caribbean gained unstoppable momentum. Britain's role in the world was shifting, from imperial power to a modern democracy wrestling with its identity. Domestically, the post-war years saw sweeping reforms. The establishment of the National Health Service, the expansion of education, and the creation of the welfare state. The sacrifices of war forged a new social contract between government and citizen. But the memories lingered. The scars of occupation and battle ran deep in the national psyche. London rebuilt its buildings, but the stories of resistance fighters, collaborators, and civilians haunted its streets. The question lingered: what if the occupation had never happened? Would Britain have still evolved into the nation it became? Or would it have remained a reluctant island, watching war rage across the continent, but untouched by fire, by fear, by sacrifice? The hypothetical invasion that once seemed impossible had rewritten the course of history. It reshaped geopolitics, accelerated alliances, and transformed societies. It forced Britain to confront its vulnerabilities, and through that confrontation, to find new strength. And as the world looked toward the atomic age and the Cold War, the lessons of occupation and liberation echoed. Freedom is never guaranteed. It is fought for, in streets, in bunkers, in hearts. The end of the war was not an end but a beginning, a painful, fragile dawn breaking over a land forever changed. Britain, scarred by occupation and battle, now faced the monumental task of rebuilding not only its cities, but its soul. The physical reconstruction was staggering. Entire neighborhoods lay in rubble. Historic landmarks, once symbols of British pride, had been shattered. The government launched massive rebuilding programs, driven by an urgent need to restore housing, industry, and infrastructure. But the wounds were deeper than bricks and mortar. The social fabric of Britain had been stretched and torn. Occupation had exposed divisions between collaborators and resistors, between classes, and between generations. Families had been broken by betrayal and survival. The question of forgiveness was not just political, it was personal. To address these fractures, the government implemented sweeping reforms. The establishment of the National Health Service in 1948 was a direct response to wartime hardships, offering free health care to all, symbolizing a new social contract. Education reforms opened doors to previously marginalized communities, fueling hopes for a more equitable future. Yet the shadow of occupation lingered in public consciousness. Stories of heroism and sacrifice were celebrated, but the darker truths, collaboration, torture, reprisals, were whispered in quiet corners. Memorials were erected, but some wounds refused to heal. Internationally, Britain found its role shifting dramatically. The empire, once sprawling, now faced accelerating demands for independence. India's path to freedom hastened, fueled in part by the contradictions of a free Britain that had itself been occupied. African and Caribbean colonies echoed with calls for self-determination. The global stage was reshaped. Britain became a bridge between the United States and the Soviet Union, navigating the treacherous waters of the emerging Cold War. Culture, too, transformed. Art, literature, and film grappled with the trauma of occupation and liberation. Writers like George Orwell and Evelyn Waugh explored themes of power, resistance, and identity in a country caught between past glory and uncertain futures. Music and theater became outlets for collective healing. The angry young men movement, emerging in the 1950s, captured the frustrations and hopes of a generation growing up in a Britain that had fought and survived but was no longer unassailable. The psychological impact was profound. Generations born during or after the war carried the legacy of occupation, resilience born of hardship, but also the trauma of loss and fear. National identity was rewritten not as imperial dominion, but as a shared story of survival and rebirth. Politically, the war accelerated changes. The Labour Party's post-war landslide victory ushered in an era of social democracy, welfare, and nationalization. The Conservative Party, once dominant, was forced to adapt or face irrelevance. The war's occupation experience created a political consciousness deeply wary of totalitarianism, but committed to social justice. And amidst this transformation, the question lingered: how had the occupation reshaped Britain's place in the world? Had it humbled an empire into a modern state, or had it sown the seeds of decline? As Britain looked to the future, it did so with the memory of invasion, not as a weakness, but as a forge that tempered its resolve. History is not just what happened, but what might have been. In this alternate world where Nazi boots marched upon British soil, and the island nation was battered, occupied, and ultimately reclaimed, the echoes of those dark years lingered long after the guns fell silent. Britain emerged from occupation battered but unbroken, forged anew in fire and shadow. The scars were etched not only into stone and steel, but into the national consciousness, an indelible reminder of vulnerability and resilience intertwined. The occupation had forced Britain to confront itself in ways peace never could. The myth of invincibility was shattered. The island fortress, once thought impregnable, was shown to bleed and fracture. But in that fracture lay strength, the strength of communities united in defiance, of ordinary citizens rising as warriors, of a society refusing to bow. The post-war years were shaped by this crucible. A nation rebuilt not just its cities, but its values. Welfare and healthcare expanded. Education became a right, not a privilege. The empire's twilight hastened, replaced by a modern Britain, diverse, democratic, and outward-looking. Yet the shadow of occupation cast long. Political tensions between former collaborators and resistors shaped discourse. The trauma of occupation lingered in literature, film, and memory. Questions of identity, what it meant to be British, were asked and re-asked, generation after generation. Globally, Britain's role shifted. Its experience as both victim and victor gave it a unique voice in the emerging Cold War. The alliance with the United States strengthened, but wariness toward Soviet intentions remained. The balance of power in Europe was forever altered by the fact that the British Isles had been a battleground. One might ask, would Britain and the world be the same if Nazi Germany had never set foot on its shores? Would the social reforms, the cultural awakenings, the political realignments have unfolded as they did? Or would history have followed a quieter, less urgent path? This thought experiment reminds us that history is fragile, contingent on moments of chance, courage, and choice. The occupation and liberation of Britain, though painful, became a crucible of transformation. A reminder that freedom must be fiercely protected, not taken for granted. And as we face new challenges today, political upheaval, ideological battles, and threats to democracy, the lessons of this alternate past resonate. That the greatest strength lies not in walls or weapons, but in the spirit of a people. So, would you want to live in a world where Britain was occupied by Nazi Germany? Where the familiar was unmade and remade in fire and shadow? Would freedom still find a way through the darkest night? The question is yours. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. How do you think history would have changed if this invasion had succeeded? What lessons do you think we can take from this alternate history to our world today? Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history and what if, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more thought-provoking content. Until next time, keep questioning the past and imagining the possibilities.